Thank you. The topic of my paper is the roots of intrinsic dignity of persons with disabilities. I'm going to skip the introduction because I just dealt with some definitions, mainly the ICF definition of disability, and I'm going to begin with the section number 1, the obscuring of dignity, the problem of the throwaway culture. Contemporary society is complex. Social phenomena are often multicausal and cannot be defined by a single aspect. However, one of the axes around which an important part of culture seems to revolve is precisely the identification of the rational as a primarily instrumental phenomenon. Indeed, not only Max Horkheimer identified that purely pragmatic reason becomes a maddening machine that ends up sacrificing its own creatures, but Joseph Ratzinger himself, in Introduction to Christianity, emphasizes that something proper to our times is that truth ceased to be seen as a property of being, verum quiescens, to be affirmed first as a property of human facts realized in the past, verum quia factum, and finally as a property of human action projected into the future, verum quia facendum. This means that reason has undergone a profound mutation. It's no longer the capacity to understand reality in its ultimate end and definitive meaning, but has become the capacity to exercise dominion and utilitarian transformation of the world, and in particular of people, especially the most vulnerable. Pope Francis synthetically calls this phenomenon the throwaway culture. The pragmatic and utilitarian drift of reason is no accident. When the truth is not dense, but by various means affirms that its consistency is tenuous, reason is subjected to the pure will to power, which no longer finds reasons to define limits. The important thing is to interpret life as a pure game of power and seek to affirm one's own self through the submission and sacrifice of the other. This mentality is painfully visible not only in the games of the self-referential market, but also in the uncomfortable coexistence with the functionally diverse, fragile, and vulnerable human being. In other words, the throwaway culture shows its absurdity when it despotically sacrifices disabled people through oblivion, isolation, lack of inclusion, and lack of due care, which sometimes reaches subtle or not so subtle forms of humiliating mistreatment. Dietrich von Hildebrand offers us a hypothesis that can illuminate this question. This important philosopher, a disciple of Edmund Husserl, devoted much of his life to explore the structure of moral life. In his analysis, he recovers many ideas from classical thought. However, he also explores new territories, such as the so-called value blindness. What does this expression mean? It means that there are people, and eventually peoples, who in certain periods, sometimes very long periods, suffer from a lack of awareness of the existence and obligatory nature of some value. Value blindness is not an error in moral judgment or a certain ignorance due to lack of study. It's rather a true eclipse in the capacity to appreciate some valuable reality. Nor is value blindness a compulsive unwillingness to look or a state of distraction. There are people with great intelligence and capacity to be attentive who, nevertheless, do not appreciate, do not esteem, do not manage to receive the provocation of a certain type of values. For example, the provocation of the dignity of the functionally diverse other. Some people, when thinking about this phenomenon, consider that a value blindness, such as the one we are describing, exempts the subject who suffers from it from responsibility. This may be true with respect to a certain specific act, but it's not true with respect to the general moral state of the subject suffering from the blindness. Blindness usually arises from a culpable lack of education in the gaze and in the affective life. There are various types of value blindness. The one that interests us with respect to the subject that concerns us is the so-called moral blindness of subsumption. This is the type of blindness that occurs in the person when individual interest or a passion habitually settles in the conscience and obscures the values that demand attention. It is not that the person doesn't understand theoretically the nature of his neighbor. It is not that the person doesn't perceive a certain conduct as wrong. In subsumption blindness, the issue is that in one's own life, the value in question is not perceived, and more or less immediately the reason invents subterfuges to justify the immoral conduct carried out in the name that, in this precise case, the situation is different. The lack of real and concrete appreciation for the dignity of the disabled person in many of us is due to the fact that rationality, driven by the will to power, clouds the conscience and orients the heart in an habitual way towards a utilitarian goal that sacrifices dignity or identifies it with a standard of functional efficiency. To sum up, when we spoke of pragmatic or instrumental rationality, we didn't mean to point to an abstract question, but rather to a concrete phenomenon of subsumption blindness that significantly determines individual and sometimes collective consciousness. Section 2. The human person is a unique, unrepeatable, irreplaceable subject. If we look closely at the most elementary human experience, we can discover that this experience is not solitary, individual, or isolated. On the contrary, the experience of the self, with all its richness and inner tensions, has always been accompanied by the experience of a you. In fact, in the first awakening of consciousness, when the central nervous system acquires a certain constitutional sufficiency, the self perceives being as an abode that welcomes it, as an embrace that shelters it, as a love that sustains it. To put it briefly, each of us discovers the meaning of being by discovering ourselves in the original relationship with the others who have engendered me, and eventually with the other who has created me. At the beginning of consciousness, although the self doesn't yet perceive analytically the being of each of its parents, much less the divine being. They are already there as a presence, as a good mystery that insinuates that one's being is not rooted in oneself, but in a complex of interpersonal relationships. In this way, the other not only indicates a certain distant similarity with respect to oneself, but the other participates with me in the fundamental human experience, enriching and illuminating it continuously. The other is not a more or less arbitrary projection of my own self, but the other contributes data that only a subjectivity full of value can offer. The self is not a subjectivity that, after existing, then alters and becomes a being along with others. Our very self, the I, lives its own experience of being, not only being along with others, but being thanks to others. The experience of the self, although it refers to the non-transferable and transcendent self that I am, cannot be explained except with the others with whom I coexist and for whom I am responsible. This is why Karl Wojtyła used to say, quote, another human being is a neighbor, not only on the basis of his generic feeling of humanity, but primarily on the basis of his being another self, end of the quote. Why we should remember this? Mainly to discover that the experience of my own irreplaceable being is constituted in an original way together with the equally irreplaceable experience of my neighbor. This is more foundational than the experience of participating in a common humanity. In other words, our common belonging to the species is not the deepest reason for the peculiar bond that each person has with each of his brothers and sisters. The basic reason why, in order to affirm myself, I need to accept the practical challenge of the presence of the other is that the other is as much as a person as I am. Indeed, the other doesn't only occur as a part of my most elementary experience in the theoretical order, but it occurs mainly as an experience in the practical order, that is, as a concrete imperative that demands a response. If I am a unique, unrepeatable, and irreplaceable case, and my neighbor is also unique, then a primary moral norm emerges that I cannot leave aside. Persona est affirmanda propter saepsem. We must love, we must affirm the person by his own or her own sake. The value of my neighbor is not that of an interchangeable or substitutable being. His value is the highest because he is a being of whom there can be no copy whatsoever. This discovery makes it possible to make the most important universalization in practical life. Every human person has the very high value of a true end and not a mere means. This right is maximally normative and true especially in cases where a purely efficiency-based approach blurs the perception of the inalienable dignity of the human person. In other words, the encounter with the other is a primarily ethical experience that constantly invites us to rediscover the non-instantializable character of people, especially those whose functional diversity segregates them and displaces them from the gaze, culture, public policies, etc. Section 3. The sources or roots of the dignity of disabled person. The sources of dignity of the disabled person cannot be different from those of the functional person. For dignity doesn't come from the fulfillment of some functional standard, but from the way being has been given to us, making us incomparably unique, making us truly end. Dignity is the value possessed by a being whose being is given in a loving act of benevolence, loving the other for the sake of the other. Therefore, to discover one's own dignity to a large extent is to discover that we are what we are because we are loved in a special way, in a very particular way, by our own sake. Or as the Spanish philosopher Carlos Diaz used to say, amor ergo sum. I'm loved, therefore I exist. This is the origin or root of the ontological dignity of the human person as a person. And this dignity gives rise to fundamental rights such as the right to life, to physical integrity, to the right to freedom of conscience of the person, etc. When ontological dignity is made to rest on the conscious state of the person, on a certain standard of neurological efficiency, on the activation of mental processes, or on something else similar, we immediately enter a scenario marked by absurdity. The fundamental dignity of the person would be subject to different degrees and levels, placing those who didn't reach a certain level in the status of a thing. People would not possess dignity because of their being, but because of their conscious doing. And with this, there would be inequality of fundamental rights. This is relevant for cases of persons with mental disability. The fact that there are certain deficits in mental processes, either temporarily or permanently, doesn't mean that the person ceases to be a person and or loses his or her dignity. The profound reason for this is the following. The being of a person doesn't presuppose consciousness, but rather it is consciousness that presupposes being. If there is no being prior to consciousness, there is no place to return to through conscious processes. Consciousness is always consciousness of being. All the consciential maturation that genetic psychology usually studies is possibly thanks to the fact that the being of the self is always greater and more original than what we consciously consider of it. Being and conscious being are not correlative. The first founds the second, not vice versa. Now, having said this, the ontological dignity of the person can manifest itself through conscious act. This is the root of the right to freedom of expression, education, political participation, etc. Likewise, the ontological dignity of the person can be exhibited through free acts when they are performed in accordance with the demands of their highest value. This is where the moral dignity of the person is displayed. This dignity obviously admits degrees and levels depending on the moral quality of the actions. On this level is based, for example, the right to a person's good reputation and the right to reply to an unjust accusation. Finally, there is a dignity granted by the community to persons who enjoy certain special qualities, such as their intelligence, their goodness, their role of authority, or their singular social significance because of a limitation. For example, here rests the dignity of magistrates or judges, but in general also of all persons who deserve being recognized positively for a quality or for physical or psychological limitation. In other words, in a certain sense, living with disability should be cause for special consideration, special respect, and care on the part of society. We are not talking here about moral dignity because of a virtuous life. Rather, we are talking about the dignity that is socially attributed to a special way of living the human condition under certain psychological and, in many cases, social limitations. In other words, the situation of vulnerability associated with disability, rather than inviting to discard, should motivate to a special respect because of the same vulnerability. I have the impression that in the recent declaration Dignitas Infinita, published by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, this is perceived in a theological sea when it is stated the following, quote, by proclaiming that the kingdom of God belongs to the poor, the humble, the despised, and those who suffer in body and spirit, by healing all sorts of illnesses and infirmities, even the most dramatic ones, such as leprosy, by affirming that whatever is done to these individuals is also done to him because he's present in them. In all these ways, Jesus brought the great novelty of recognizing the dignity of every person, especially those who were considered unworthy. This new principle in human history, which emphasized that individuals are even more worthy of our respect and love when they are weak, scorned, or suffering, even to the point of losing the human figure, has changed the face of the world. End of the quote. Section 4. The normative ultimate foundation is different from the metaphysical ultimate foundation. With what has been said above, it's possible to say with certainty that the dignity of the person must be recognized beyond any circumstance, beyond any context, beyond the particularities of this or that culture. In order to be able to have an eventual situated thought, to be able to denounce eventual colonizations in societies, to be able to adequately value cultures, it's necessary to recognize the dignity of every person as a meta-contextual principle. When the dignity of the person and his fundamental moral imperative are thus recognized, a light is found that allows the development of a critical theory based on a robust, ontologically founded anthropology. When the recognition of meta-contextual principles, such as the one mentioned here, is explicitly or implicitly renounced, thought easily collapses into an endless relativism, that is, into an immanentism that closes off the possibility of truly affirming that reality has primacy over our modest interpretation. However, we still need to clarify a delicate question. Dignity is a value that, when discovered by the practical reason of the person, allow us to formulate a primary moral precept, the personalistic norm of action. Where does the binding force of this norm come from? Why does the response to the value that we call dignity have a moral necessity for the conscience and for the free will? In some Jewish naturalist authors, it was common to maintain that the obligatory force of any imperative is due to the lex eterna of God that participates in the creature. Since God exists, and since there are precepts promulgated by him, the obligation to comply with them proceeds from their divine origin. For instance, I quote one very famous work in this field in Latin America, one big book of Octavio Nicolas de Risi, but there are many other Thomistic philosophers that in former times supported this idea. In our opinion, a metaphysical explanation of the natural law in effect, in fact, demands that it be recognized as a participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. However, we have wanted to insist that the practical obligatoriness of the personalistic norm of action comes from human dignity. Therefore, the fact that this dignity is a perfection that the human being possesses by the fact of having an act of being that constitutes him as an entity per se, will per se, doesn't mean that only by accepting the existence of God as the ontological foundation of the person is the absolute respect due to each person obligatory. In the practical order, that is, from the point of view of the way in which the experience of action is constituted, the encounter with the person is sufficient for the absolute imperative that derives from his dignity to be unconditionally binding. This is important because it focuses attention on the dignity of the person and doesn't displace it to the always complex issue of the existence of God and its argument. Dignity, then, is a constitutive dimension of the person that is the source of the binding nature of the personalist norm of action, persona est affirmanda propter se ipsam. The personalist norm is a moral principle that should deactivate the evaluation of persons by their efficiency, and that rather obliges us all to look at the functional diversity of persons from a supra-utilitarian criterion. Only with this criterion is it possible to make a more inclusive culture and therefore a slightly more human society. Conclusion. People with disabilities are a borderline issue that tests the moral sentiments of contemporary culture. We are currently in a resurgence of morality everywhere. Social media is awash with uplifting moral praises and value-driven living. However, if we look more closely, this new moment is not entirely clear. For Gilles Lipovetsky, we find ourselves, I quote, in the emergence of an ethical regulation of an unprecedented kind. Through the charitable and humanitarian effervescence, what is at work once again is the eclipse of duty. Under the old habits of morality, the post-moralistic functioning of our societies is actually organized. What is very loosely called the return of morality merely precipitates the exit of the moralistic epoch from the democracies by instituting a morality without obligation or sanction, in keeping with the mass aspirations of individualistic hedonistic democracies, end of the quote. At no other time has there been so much talk about people with disabilities and their rights. However, new forms of marginalization and stigmatization are appearing on the scene. Therefore, perhaps it's time for a more profound review based on the recognition that every human being has disabilities to some degree, and that eventually they may be further amplified by age, illness, mishap, etc. Perhaps it's time to relearn to see that the encounter with value generates a duty without which value itself is silenced in its call, in its vocation, in its profound nature. Perhaps it's time to affirm that every person, especially the disabled, deserves our welcome, our inclusion, our integration, as we said yesterday, and our commitment, because this is the measure of the degree of humanity of our society. Everything is put to the test when a person is partially or totally excluded from the path of development that we all deserve because of our own dignity. Thank you.